Very good evening to all those who joined today, uh, and thanks for the invitation to speak to all of you about the uh, National Education Policy 2020, which was adopted by the Union Cabinet a few days ago. When I look, someone like me from my generation looks at this National Education Policy document, we would be reminded of a previous battle on the question of education policy, which we fought at the time that, say, I was a student, which was in the 1980s, when what was then called the new education policy, formalized in the form of the National Policy on Education of 1986, was adopted. Before the National Education Policy of 1986 was adopted, a vision document about the future of Indian education had come in the form of a document called the Challenge of Education. And when reading the National Policy on Education 2020 in its original form, when the report came from the committee, then in the draft form, which was a much more abbreviated version of the original report, and the final form in which it has come been declared today. When reading these one, I was in a sense reminded of the Challenge of Education document, because at that time I recall that when reading that document, the Challenge of Education, I felt that so many parts of that particular document and its analysis of the problems of Indian education would seem to be had seemed to be of a kind which you would always tend to agree with. Okay, so in a sense, large part of the, if you just counted the words and the sentences in that document, seem to articulate or express things that one would tend to agree with as proper diagnosis of the ills of Indian education. But at the end of it, came the real operative part about what was the prescribed solution to that particular problem, and that's where the real story always was, and that's the part which eventually meant that the student movement, teachers movement, etc., had to take up a battle against that particular policy, which was now that particular policy was taken at a time in which trajectory of India's economy, trajectory of India's education system that has since taken shape, uh, particularly the whole context of liberalization and globalization, was still in its nascent stages. Uh, but today we are talking about a context in which more than 30 years have passed since that particular time, and since almost 30 years have passed since uh, the 1991 economic reforms, which represented the big shift in Indian economic policy, and which opened up India to a process of greater integration with the world economy. Okay. Now, the trajectory that India's education system and India's economy has traversed in those last 3 decades, if one looks at that and places the National Policy on Education 2020 within that particular background, okay, and also the more immediate background of the more recent times, then and then only can one really understand what is the real game or behind this National Policy on Education 2020. And what is it that is the real intention behind this urgency that is being shown in adopting such a policy and to start implementing its provisions. Okay. Now, if one looks at the background, so let's say look at the question of the education system itself. what has happened between say 91 and 2020 to Indian education, and particularly what has happened in this current century. If one looks at that, the most important feature of the Indian education system from school to higher education in the last 2 decades has been a rampant process of privatization of the education system. And you have official statistics which will corroborate that. So in a country which is still an extremely poor country, 45%, at least 45%, this is slightly dated data, more recent data is not available, at least 45%, if not more, of the enrollment in schools, school education, is in private schools. And only about half is in government schools. Okay. This is a very high proportion of enrollment in private schools, which you are unlikely to see even in very advanced economies where average income levels may be significantly high. So we have had such a massive expansion of the private school sector that now 45% of plus of the enrollment is in private schools. If one looks at higher education, you see a similar trajectory. So if you look at our college enrollment, 45% of college enrollment now is in private unaided colleges, okay, which is that colleges which don't receive any form of government assistance. And another 21% odd is in the private aided category, and only the balance is in government colleges. If you look at the professional education component within higher education, you find the private sector's role is even greater. More than 70% of the enrollment in undergraduate programs in professional courses and more than 60% in postgraduate courses are in private unaided institutions which are not receiving any assistance from the government. Universities, the university sector, university enrollment, that's the one place where you can say that the public institutions still are dominant, okay, and that dominance is greatest and it has lasted the longest. However, even there the picture has been changing, okay. So while private universities account for now about 16 to 17% of the total enrollment, okay, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, say 2014-15 to 2018-19, then you find that in this period, if you look at the increase in the enrollment that has happened in universities at this period, 55% of that increase has taken place in private universities. Okay. And of the balance 45, the major part, 33% of the total increase in enrollment in the last 5 years has happened in public universities which are open universities, not in the regular universities where the enrollment is almost stagnant, okay, in state universities even declining. So even in higher education or up to the university, undergraduate education has become significantly privatized. Even university education is moving in the direction of increased privatization. Okay. So this is this great rapid process of privatization has been a feature of Indian education in the last 2 decades, particularly has been particularly marked feature of the last 2 decades. Now, if you look at the National Policy on Education 2020, does that policy look at this process as something that is dangerous, something that is unwanted, something that should be reversed? It does not. It does not say, it does not acknowledge that this significant degree of privatization that has happened in Indian education is something that is a problem, something that needs to be reversed. So when it talks about the future of Indian education, it actually talks about have non private philanthropic institutions playing an extremely important role in the further expansion and development of Indian education from school to higher education. So it is a policy that is not pitting itself against or seeking to uh, undo, correct, or change course correct in terms of the process of privatization of Indian education. It is instead saying that private and public institutions should be treated at par because both sets of institutions ultimately have the same objective, which is the promotion of quality education. Okay. So it is in fact saying that now the time has come to look at private and public institutions at par, and therefore the future of Indian higher education, Indian education is not really focused on expanding public education. So while there is reference to expanding public education, while there is reference to investment in public education, increasing the reference in public education, all that is really undone by refusing to even acknowledge the high degree of privatization that has already happened in Indian education, okay, and the need for any kind of course correction on that. Instead, it appears to be a policy which, in the name of expanding education by encouraging private philanthropic initiatives in education, is seeking to further that process of privatization. And it's that which explains why the whole conceptualization of the future of the education system is in terms of one in which private and public institutions will be at par. The the second aspect which needs to be kept in mind is that this process of privatization of Indian education, okay, uh, yeah, in the national policy on education does of course acknowledge that there is a fair degree of commercialization of Indian education, but its solution to that particular problem is that your regulatory system should be one which discourages commercialization but promotes and actively promotes private philanthropic initiatives in education. The institutions which are inspired by private institutions inspired by philanthropic purposes, okay, which is basically in the form of not-for-profit institutions. But it does not in the process recognize the very simple fact that the entire proliferation of uh, private institutions in Indian education has always been in the name of not-for-profit institutions. Education has always remained a not-for-profit sector. Law does not allow profit-making institutions to be involved in schools, universities, colleges, etc. Nominally, they are all not-for-profit institutions. But even when it acknowledges that not-for-profit institutions has been this growth has been associated with commercialization, okay, it ignores the fact that it has happened in the name of not-for-profit institutions, and by encouraging such not-for-profit activity in education, it is actually encouraging the process of privatization further. The second important element in the longer-term background to the National Policy on Education 2020 that is to be kept in mind is that this process where we have seen increased privatization of education has come in the background of a larger economic context in which uh, you have had a process of extreme rise in inequalities in India in ownership of wealth and in the distribution of income. An extreme rise which has meant that a very small segment of the Indian population uh, uh, and the corporate sector has been the principal beneficiary of most of the growth that has taken place in the last 20 to 30 years. And 90% of the Indian population, 90% of the Indian population has experienced not only a declining share in the total income that is generated within the Indian economy, but also a relative problem of stagnation in their earnings or their incomes. Because the large majority of the Indian population has been faced with the problem of uh, lack of employment, underemployment, and even when they get employment, no matter which sector they get it in, the earnings from that employment are extremely low. And that has been the more or less steady feature for the last 3 decades. Reflecting of that is the fact that even in the organized industrial sector in India, real wages have been stagnant for 30 years. Where you have unions and labor laws, etc., even there you have had a stagnation in wages for 30 years, while profits from the same activities have gone up tremendously. So this increased inequality that has been a feature of this particular trajectory. Okay, and the process of privatization have some relationship with each other. Okay? One is that the process of increasing inequality is part of an economic trajectory in which you promote the privatization of all activities. Promotion of the privatization of education, opening it up as a profit making activity or commercializing it has been part of that process. It's not something outside that. Okay. The second is that the developments in education have contributed to this process of increasing inequality itself. And they've done so in two ways. One way has been simply this, that okay, once the uh, process sector becomes more privatized, education becomes more costly. In fact, we have had a situation where even in public institutions, fees have been increasing. It has become more costly to study even in public institutions. The result of that is, of course, that the access people can have to that education gets limited to those who can pay and those who have the resources for that. And for large sections of the Indian population, it becomes very difficult for them to go beyond a certain stage and difficult for them to even up to the stage at which they are able to go in the process of educating their children in their families, uh, they are not able to necessarily access the best possible education that is available because of the lack of the resources. So one is simply shutting out large numbers of people from access to education. That's been one feature of it. The other is this, that the process of increasing inequality, one aspect of it has been, and the very limited growth of employment opportunities has been also been characterized by a scenario in which one category of employees uh, in the economy, a certain stratum of white collar employment, which is very high salary, high income, has emerged. While for the large majority of people who work, who labor, it's been low wage employment that has been the only option available. And the gap between these two has also increased over time. So the rise of this kind of white collar employment with high salaries has meant, of course, a growing middle class aspiration for an education which will allow them access to those particular jobs. Okay. And willingness, therefore, to even pay for that because of the fact that high earnings are believed to be the gain that you would eventually get from this education. On the other side, for the large majority of the Indian population, which does not have the same kind of means, okay, these realities that have emerged have also meant that there is also, I mean, in those sections also, there is an increasing aspiration for social and economic mobility. And what has happened is that that increased aspiration has translated into an increasing demand for education because education appears to be the only route that is available to have any kind of mobility, because other than that there's no process by which you're going to acquire assets, acquire wealth. There's no redistribution happening of the wealth in this society. So for those who are disadvantaged economically disadvantaged, socially, uh, victims of discrimination. For them, the only kind of option for any kind of mobility is if they can get an education. So the demand for an education has been increasing in India from both the more better off segments of Indian society, uh, including the middle class, as well as the relatively more disadvantaged sections of Indian society. To the extent that they are often willing to bear significant cost disproportionate to their earnings in order to get their children educated. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that both these sources of the increased demand for education has been rampantly exploited by the private sector in education. Uh, because the public funding is something that simply did not increase to keep pace with this increased demand for education. So actually, if you see in the last 20, 30 years, increased privatization of Indian education has been accompanied by significant increases in enrollment at every stage, with the most kind of dramatic change taking place in higher education, where the enrollment proportion of young Indians who are enrolled in institutions of higher education have increased significantly compared to what they used to be in our time when we were students. So it's a pretty dramatic increase that has taken place. But it's really the private sector that has exploited this particular thing, and exploited, of course, in terms of not necessarily offering the best quality education, and for such a large number of people increasing who are getting this kind of an education, it's not that employment opportunities have been opened up on a very large scale, uh, commensurate with what they have spent on that education. Okay. So now the absence of adequate public investment in education is also related to one other element of this economic trajectory, which is that this process which has given rise to increasing inequality has been this part of that economic trajectory has been the enshrining of a policy where the government refuses to tax those who have high incomes heavily, and also refuses to spend heavily. So don't tax too much, because if you have a trajectory of development which is based on a leading role being played by private capital, then that particular trajectory says that, or implication of that trajectory is that you have to induce and encourage private investment. So if private investment happens, private capital invests, makes a large profit, and if you tax that very heavily, then the incentive for that investment uh, uh, like, will be hurt, and therefore you don't tax heavily. You actually give tax concessions to the extent possible in order to induce that investment, so that you get your growth and development. If you want to induce private investment, you therefore don't encroach upon potential areas on which private sector can invest and make a profit, and therefore you don't spend too much either. Okay, you don't tax too much, you don't spend too much, and you try and ensure that your fiscal deficit remains within a target. You even enact a law which mandates that you have to keep that deficit within a certain limit, uh, without any reference to the actual circumstances that your country or your society or your economy is facing. So this kind of an approach where you seek to curb public expenditure and keep taxation low, promote private investment, has been part of the process by which, on the one side, you encourage privatization in education, because that's also one sector where profitable investment can happen. On the other side, you don't spend enough in terms of public expenditure on education, because you have to keep your uh, government fiscal in balance, government accounts in balance. You don't spend too much on that education either. Okay. Now, if you look at the national policy on education 2006, does it at any stage reflect a departure from this trajectory? Does it even suggest any departure from that trajectory, or does it visualize a future in which India will move away from this highly unequal kind of trajectory of growth and development that it has followed in the last 30 years? No. In fact, it locates the perspective of underlying the national policy on education is that this trajectory is what is the trajectory, this trajectory and more of this is what is going to be in the future, because it says that or it visualizes a future in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, a future in which almost all unskilled jobs would be taken over by machines. That's according to it, the trajectory of development of technology and things like that. Uh, Artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. Everything is pushing in the direction where the manual, unskilled kind of jobs uh, will tend to disappear. Okay, what will be remaining are new kinds of jobs where the creative, so-called creative abilities of individuals and their multidisciplinary skills will matter. And that's the angle from which it comes in and talks about an education system that needs to create a skilled workforce which will possess this kind of abilities and allow India to realize this grand ambition of being a global knowledge superpower. Uh, so that's the framework within which it looks at the question of the role of education. And in fact, in that process, when it looks at it that way, it actually takes away everything from the function of education in the progress of Indian society, uh, and reduces it to the question of producing a skilled workforce which is capable of performing those jobs which this existing trajectory of development will be able to, they will be the only jobs that are there of the future. So what happens to the rest of the Indian population which cannot get these jobs? So for them, there's vocational education as a way of giving them the way of doing something on the basis of which they can be employed. But the core of the process is the creation of this skilled workforce, a narrow stratum which will be able to participate in this new knowledge economy that is going to be the economy of the future. Okay. So it doesn't depart in any way from a conception of economic trajectory of the kind that we have seen in the last 20, 30 years, which has been the source of this huge increase in inequality and huge increases in endemic unemployment in India. Now, the other side of that continuity in its perspective is that it does not, while it says, it repeats the commitment to spending 6% of GDP on education, a target that was set in 1968 to be achieved by 1985 and hasn't been achieved till date. Okay. While it talks about that and the importance of public investment in education, at no place in that policy will you find any suggestion that this is the background of India's economy, where a small stratum of the population has cornered much of the gains of growth in the last 30 years. Their share, the top 10% share in Indian income is 55%, more than 55% now. A lot of it takes the form of corporate profits. You should tax the rich and the corporate sector more heavily in order to finance public education, investment in education. Nowhere is that suggestion made. If no suggestion of this kind or any other kind is made about how public investment in education is going to be actually increased, okay, if no such proposal exists in the national policy on education, then it must be concluded that the so-called commitment to increasing public investment in education is a hollow commitment for which there is no serious conviction or commitment. Because if you don't have a proposal, how would it, for decades you've been having that target and not achieved it. And even today you have no answer as to how it is to be done. You have a tax to GDP ratio that has been stagnating for a long time. It's not increasing. You have a commitment to maintaining a low fiscal deficit. So where are you going to find the resources for increasing public investment? If you are serious, if you were serious about it, you would have put forward some concrete proposals, and this is the standard thing that can be done, which is that you tax those who benefited the most to increase public investment in education. It doesn't do that. Instead, what does it say? It says that it doesn't find an answer to the question of public investment, but it finds an answer or seeks to find a solution to the problem of investment in education via the private sector. So the corporate sector, which has been the beneficiary of cornering so much of the gains of growth, taking it away from those whose laboring activity and work has contributed to that process immensely, okay, it should be encouraged to do philanthropic investment in education. So you take what you have taken away by your process of exploitation, okay, appropriation, you will go and invest it and return it to that society from which you have taken it in the form of philanthropic investment in education. That's the model that is being talked about here. So it is those who have been the private capital that has benefited from your growth trajectory, it must also take the leading role in the expansion of Indian education, which is to, if you leave aside the grand words that are used to describe all of this, it is all about promoting further the privatization and commercialization of Indian education. Okay. Furthering the process that we have already seen has already gone a fair distance, even before this particular policy has come into place. But there is a third very important aspect of the contemporary reality, uh, which uh, which itself has two dimensions that one should keep in mind in understanding the so-called urgency behind this decision to implement the national education policy, even in the background of a pandemic, and announcing that its implementation is going to start soon in phases. And this is that particular trajectory in which so much increase in inequality has taken place in India, such great polarization has happened, such rampant unemployment and underemployment has come to characterize the life of most of the Indian people. Uh, that particular trajectory of development has also been running into a crisis. Okay. There are parts of this crisis which have been visible for a long period of time, almost a decade. Okay. There are parts of the, or there are signs of that, there were signs of this crisis increasing in severity even before the COVID-19 pandemic came. You're all aware that there was this very significant slowing down of Indian GDP growth that happened before anyone in the world had heard about coronavirus or COVID-19. Okay. Before that itself, there were the signs of this, that this crisis was becoming deeper. And on top of that has come the pandemic and the colossal failure to control the spread of that infection, which has meant that the disruption that to the economy that is being caused has become extremely long, and the approach that the government has followed in this particular process, of course, meant that the crisis for the people also has been extremely severe. So there is a process of an unfolding crisis, deepening crisis of this particular trajectory. One side of that particular crisis has been the narrowing, the absence of or narrowing down of opportunities for profitable investment. So investment itself has been stagnating for almost 10 years, particularly because of the inability of the industrial sector to grow, because of infrastructure sector running into difficulties. So the investment options have been disappearing and reduced. Okay, so profitably you can invest resources. So one implication of that is a quest for more opportunities for investment, and to the extent that education offers an opportunity, private capital is interested in further opening up of that sector for private investment. Second implication of this is that with the profitable options declining, there is also this increasing pressure for tax cuts to increase the returns on investments. Whatever you invest, if your profits are being squeezed, uh, and is being squeezed because the problem with increasing inequality has been that it has narrowed the market on the basis of which any profitable economic activity can happen, and the absence of adequate demand has now caught up with this growth trajectory, where because it has left so many Indians behind, it's itself now getting dragged down by the fact that it has not created the market necessary to sustain that particular growth. But that's not the way corporate capital looks at it. So when it sees a problem that profits are not adequate, that there isn't enough demand, which is because of which their profits are threatened by shrinking, it says to it demands from the government, please cut taxes so that the effective post-tax return on my investment increases. And this pressure for tax cuts is combined with a situation where the slowing down of economic activities has already starts hitting the revenues of the government. If economic activity is adversely affected, tax revenues to the government also gets affected. So what you have is that the crisis of not having enough money to spend, which was inherent in this trajectory throughout, is also becoming more serious or deeper, and therefore the quest for looking for ways of cutting down public investment, public expenditure is also that much stronger. Okay. Now, of course, all of these happen because the, the policy choices of the government are being shaped by not the 90% which has lost out, but by the 10% which has gained by the corporate sector. So what you have had is essentially a process in which policy making has been captured by a minority to a much greater extent than would normally be the case. Okay, because the policy itself has increased that power of the corporate sector and the top 10% on Indian policy making. Because if you have a policy in which government cannot promote the a process of economic development directly, it has to encourage private investment, then private capital also acquires a greater leverage over the state, and the state has to do things to encourage that private investment, and therefore it's the private capital and those behind it who are able to dictate the terms to the government in terms of what policy should be. So this capturing of policy making by a minority essentially means that a process of undermining any democracy. Okay. And as the crisis has become deeper and graver, the possibility of reconciling meeting the interests of this minority of corporate capital with giving some relief to the rest of the population, which is facing economic distress, becomes even more difficult. So that contradiction becomes even more difficult to manage, which means that the only way you can really manage it is that you have, and at the same time, this deepening divide that was already there created an objective basis for, in some form, the losing out of 90% of the Indian population expressing itself in the form of some rebellion, even if that rebellion was only in the form of through the ballot changing the government. So through the ballot changing the government, exercising the nominal freedoms or democratic rights that are supposed to be guaranteed by the Indian Constitution, these are all ways in which that discontent, that rebellion could potentially express itself. So the trajectory itself requires a hollowing out of even that nominal democratic structure, so that the capture of the minority over what the governments do is not threatened in any way. That's the background to the process of increasing communalization that we have seen, the marriage between communalization and this trajectory of development, where the poison of communalization, of Hindu nationalism, is the way in which you address this problem, consolidate a support which gives you the cover for putting in place essentially an increasingly authoritarian structure. So this erosion of India's secular democracy that we have seen happening, okay, and which is integrally related to this economic trajectory. Behind that, or related to, I mean, education is also a sphere that is related to that. Education could be a sector. The process of educating can be a process by which you foster and facilitate such the ideology that goes with, the ideology that accompanies this whole process of increasing authoritarianism. So education becomes a potential, can be a potential instrument for that. Okay. On the other hand, education by its very nature, and particularly if you have a mass education system which draws in all those who are the losers of this process of development, is also capable of, that process of education is also capable of fostering and giving development of, fostering the process of struggles for progressive transformation of Indian society to in a more egalitarian, more democratic direction. So education is a potential instrument. Education is also a potential threat for this whole process of communalization and authoritarianism, which is the necessary requirement of the current trajectory, current stage of this trajectory of development. So that also finds its way into the making of the national policy on education, where you need to have ensure that the education policy, you have a demand from education from society. Okay. So there is an increasing pressure on, even if you have an authoritarian structure, okay, there is an increasing pressure for that education. How do you meet that demand, or limit that demand, and as well as meet it in ways which is not going to be A, costly, B, is not going to create dangerous problems like students struggling for reduction in fees, against privatization, against Citizenship Amendment Act, all of which you have seen has been a feature of that the expansion of people in education, particularly university education and higher education, has had an impact on society in terms of a greater challenge or protests and movements that are inspired by, broadly speaking, egalitarian and democratic and secular ideals also being fostered by this context. So that challenge has to be quelled. And we've seen the assault on education that has happened from the state in the last few years. Institutions, students, faculty, uh, their movements or struggles have been met with a combination of uh, demonization of these institutions, uh, the portrayal of them as anti-national, this, that, and everything, as well as the throwing of the full arm of state power, the full power of the state against them, which you can see in the form of uh, the arrest of so many people who are now lying in jail. Uh, Unimaginable things which you would not have imagined would have happened even 15 years ago are happening. Anybody is picked up, arrested, UAPA, sedition, they are in jail, they can't come out, they won't get bail, even if COVID kills them, they will die in jail, it will not be released. So this kind of thing, the assault that you've seen, reflects what? That it reflects that they are trying to quell the potentially progressive tendencies that a mass education system can generate, and push it in the direction of becoming an instrument for the ideological agenda that fosters unity, peace, and order, even if the social reality is completely in a state of disorder. Uh, so that agenda also finds its way into this thing. And you have this peculiar formulation of India's the education system. This education policy is inspired by ancient Indian knowledge traditions and systems, and aspires to making India a global knowledge superpower in the future. Again, if you leave aside all the tall talk, essentially the reality is about ensuring that the education process and the education system is emaciated of all its capacity to play a role in the progressive transformation of Indian society, because that progressive transformation of Indian society must necessarily come into conflict with the trajectory of development that is happening and has happened over 30 years, and the trajectory of development that the current regime wishes to produce. And that's this is the background within which this national policy of education has been formulated. This is the agenda then: privatization, increased privatization, of education, eliminating its capacity to play any progressive role, and for that purpose, it also conceptualizes or creates a structure of control and regulation of this entire system, which will allow this agenda to be pursued. So the regulatory and governance structure of Indian education that the national policy on education permeates that particular policy is a highly top-down, so-called leadership-driven model, in which, while lip service is played to the so-called autonomy of teachers and the fostering the creativity of students and all of that, ultimately what you're trying to do is create a structure in which you, from the top, there will be control that will come through the regulatory structure. At the level of institutions, you will have leaderships or boards of management which are not accountable to students, will therefore be the clients, and teachers will be the employees whom these institutions hire in order to serve those clients or customers. Okay, that's the framework of governance and regulation that is being envisaged, in which the levers of control will remain at the top, and autonomy and freedom to institutions is all about liberating them from the controls and regulations which prevent them from making the maximum profit out of that particular activity. So it's about liberating them from fees, controls over fees. It is about this whole restructuring of programs. For example, in higher education, you can get a 1-year diploma, you can get a 2-year certificate, you can get a 3-year bachelor's, you can get a 4-year degree. These are all about, and the so-called flexibility, creating an academic bank where you can have accumulate your credits. These are all about creating the flexibility, not for the students. Okay, for the students, it's an illusion that you can in 2020 do one course or 1-year education, in 2025 do another year, and 2030 do another year, and the three together will become a BA, a bachelor's degree. So this it's an illusion being created that people will have the choice that if you don't have the money to study for 3 years, okay, you study 1 year, you can still get eventually a degree. You earn something, you get a second year, and things like that. But the real thing is to be able to allow private institutions to offer a menu of courses and options which will cater to different segments of the market and allow them to maximize their particular profit. Okay, so if you can't, you offer one product to those who can only study for a year, you offer another product to someone who can study for 4 years, and this way you can maximize the profits from what is otherwise a differentiated kind of market. So that's the logic of all this flexibility. And really, in terms of the question of the, if you, for example, in higher education, if you see the structure, you have a higher education regulatory authority which is going to be overseeing the process of regulation, uh, Higher Education Council of India. You will have four verticals within that. You have a National Higher Education Council, you have a National Accreditation Council, you have a Higher Education Grants Council, you have a General Education Council. Someone will do regulation, someone will set standards, someone will decide whether you are can be licensed to be an educational institution or not. Someone else will give you your grants if you're a public institution. And then there is the National Research Foundation, which will allocate research funds to institutions depending upon whether it thinks that they are doing good research or not. So if you look at this particular structure, actually much greater government control is being put into place over education. This is, I'm illustrating with higher education, is being put into place on what happens in educational institutions. Where they have flexibility is that within this framework, they can they they can offer different things by which they can make money, raise resources. Public institutions can also raise fees, raise more resources, depend less on government. And the whole structure is created is one in which government control doesn't come with the simultaneous commitment to provide the resources. That's the meaning of treating everyone similarly. So today, if UGC puts a regulation on any central and public university, particularly a central university turns back and says, give me the money for that also, which will allow me to meet that particular requirement. What is being put in place is structure in which you can't do that anymore. And every institution will be separate in terms of setting its uh, terms and conditions for its employees, for its students, etc. But in terms of meeting the requirements and standards, so-called standards, it will be accountable to the regulatory structure under the control of the central government. That's the kind of structure that is being put into place, because that is what is the requirement of the whole agenda that this particular national policy on education is promoting. So with that, let me conclude. I think I've taken a little longer than I intended to, uh, uh, because but there are so many aspects of this national policy on education which can be elaborated upon. But that would, I think, this essential, I what I try to do is to bring out the essence of what the National Policy on Education 2020 is all about and why the urgency to implement it is being seen today. So with that, let me conclude, and if there are any questions anyone has, I can maybe try and address a few. Okay, so thanks everyone for listening with patience, and I hope it has been useful for all of you. Thank you. So I believe there were some questions, but I'm trying to figure out where those questions are. I'm sorry, but I don't see any questions anywhere. Okay, so I've received a few questions. Uh, One is, I mean, relates to this early uh, child care and education, which is the proposal that you don't start at 6, but you start earlier. Uh, but if you look at this particular proposal, you find that how does it wish to do that? It places the burden of this on the Anganwadi workers and hopes to train those Anganwadi workers to do this particular discharge, this particular duty by doing online courses which they can do alongside their existing work. Okay. So this is an instance really of this approach of looking for cheap ways of uh, dealing with the question of education. Similar proposal exists to rationalize and consolidate schools to do away with a number of schools which are deemed to be economically suboptimal, uh, which are schools that exist in somewhat remote areas as part of a process of making education accessible to the children in those remote areas. So they want to do away with those things also. Uh, so uh, there is ultimately, if you want to expand the access to education, uh, you will have to uh, build that entire structure around a massive increase in public investment in education. Once that is not happening, once that is not happening, this whole talk about increasing the access, increasing the level of education for people is largely illusory. You find the same kind of approach to the question of increasing enrollment in higher education. So when you talk about increasing gross enrollment in higher education, you talk about using digital technologies to online education and distance learning as a way of increasing this. Because why do you say that? Because you really don't want to spend money, too much money on this particular process. Nor do you want that process of education, that increase in enrollment to become a so-called problem, because these people become educated and then they ask too many questions about what's happening in their country, to their communities, to their lives, to their societies. So distance education, online education as the way of dealing with this problem. All of these have the common element that they do not make significant demands on the public resources, on public investment in education. So, so there is no real question of significance of the uh, increasing the access to education or improving education through these measures. Okay. That is illusory. There is also a question about the question of vocational education. Of course, vocational education uh, is something that by itself is something good. It's good if people have vocational training for different kinds of, it's a part of a process of increasing the level of skills, employability, okay. But if you look at this particular policy, in this, vocationalization is not about doing this. Vocationalization is about essentially, so the core of the process is to sift out an elite which will be the top layer of the workforce of the future, which will be able to participate in this new knowledge economy, okay, and benefit from it. The rest, who will be left out in that process, you think of vocational education as a way of somehow trying to uh, uh, to tell them that, okay, you also have some chance to do something, even if you can't make it to that particular top. So that's the problem with this whole question of the approach to vocational education. It's not tied in. It's not tied in with a notion of a particular process in the economy in which large segments of the population will be able to find gainful employment and to prepare them for that. Okay. So apart from not having a broader vision of education, or having a more limited, broader vision of education, in which education is not just about creating the workers for the economy, the skilled workers for the economy, but an education is a process which contributes to the larger development of the society. Uh, Instead of one kind of narrowing is to by focusing a lot more on the role of the education system in creating the workforce for the economy. The second is within that also. You are essentially designing it to create a workforce for an economy which will need only a few workers. Okay. And the vocational education is not about creating the workers for that economy. Vocational education is about uh, giving people who are going to be left out something to do. Okay. Not about creating the opportunities for their employment and vocational training as something that feeds that particular process. Okay. So that's the difficulty or the problem in the way in which vocational education is looked at within this. So this is why I'm repeating this. I go back to the challenge of education. The national policy of education and the challenge of education both share this particular common feature, that you will find several lines within it and several propositions within it with which you might tend to agree, okay, when you look at them in isolation, but place them ultimately within the totality of what is being proposed, and then you will see that a lot of the things that are sound very nice are either not serious intentions of the policy, okay, are certainly not serious in the sense that you might think about it. So critical thinking, developing critical thinking of students, uh, developing the range of their abilities across ability to which will be across several disciplines, is not about making them better human beings, better citizens, able to contribute to the progress of society in general in several fields of life. It's about creating the people who can participate in that knowledge economy. So it's all about technology development, and the whole notion of modernization of society is reduced to the question of technology. Otherwise, you go back to ancient Indian knowledge and a formulation where ancient Indian knowledge is there, modern knowledge is there, but there's nothing in between. And I think most of you will understand why the in between is missing. There's ancient and modern, but there's no medieval. There's no history in between the ancient Indian traditions and the modern system, modern conditions. Why that is missing should also be clear and gives a sense of what is the kind of agenda that is being promoted. There are questions about the question of who will do all this teaching. Uh, of course, if you want to expand the range, you have to expand the number of teachers, you have to expand the range of skills that are available within the teachers. But and while the whole policy keeps talking about teachers being this central element in that whole process of this development of Indian education, the, every proposal about how education is going to be managed and governed is one in which you are disenfranchising teachers. That's the structure that is being proposed. So the commitment to autonomy of teachers and them being the central uh, drivers of this whole process is an empty commitment, because it doesn't even propose any kind of a structure of managing the system in which that can be ensured. Instead, it is proposing a structure in which uh, every teacher's life and career will depend on those who are sitting on top in managing them. And where is the scope for any teacher's creativity, autonomy, etc., to express itself in such conditions? And you are even eliminating the regulations which kind of guarantee some minimum protection to teachers and their conditions. So today, for example, in higher education, you have regulations which specify the service conditions of teachers. Good, bad, whatever it is, some conditions are specified where institutions have to comply with that. Now you are saying that there will be no such things. Institutions can decide on their own. So the board of a board which is not elected, a board which is self-reproducing, will decide what conditions its teachers will have, what will be the terms of appointment, employment, whether it will be regular, contractual, whatever it will be in the hands of that particular board, and teachers have to be accountable to that board. Where is the scope for any teacher's creativity and autonomy to express itself in such a system? So keep in mind that there are several things which will look nice to begin with, but one has to look behind them into the real essence of the policy. And the essential question that must be always asked is that if you are serious about expanding Indian education to enable equitable access to that education for all Indian citizens, irrespective of their social and economic background. Okay. Then where is the concrete proposals about expanding public investment in education and how that is to be achieved? Is your policy centered around that as the key foundation on which you build the entire policy, or is your policy built on some other foundation? And on that test, you will find the National Policy on Education 2020 will always fail. If you look for this question in it, answer in it, all the commitment to doing this, doing that, is it accompanied by anything which is suggesting how public investment in education is to be expanded? Is it accompanied by anything which suggests how the freedom, autonomy the of the academic processes is going to be ensured, okay, without excessive government control and interference? If you find that, then you can say that the policy test passes the test of being serious about meeting these objectives. If not, then it fails. And I'm pretty certain if you look at it closely, you will find that it will always fail this particular test, because it is not meant for promoting a mass education system which will open up the potentialities for the mass of the Indian population, because opening up the potentialities for development of mass of the Indian population is fundamentally incompatible with the economic, social, political trajectory towards which the current regime in India wishes to push the country. It's fundamentally incompatible with that. And therefore, you will not see this being the key foundation of that particular policy. Okay, so it's 9:40 now, so let me conclude. Uh, Thank you all for listening with patience, and maybe we can have another interaction later if you people are interested.